Also, a DVD with 900 survival and off-grid living documents and the offline home canning how to do everything website all on the DVD. So when you're growing all that food, you know how to can it, store it, preserve it, etc. with all these documents. So thank you for tuning in to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. I hope that you will pick up this package and start learning to be free. Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, where information never sleeps and freedom is one seed that needs to be planted.
What we do in life, it goes in eternity.
Hi, good morning, and this is Christine Joanna Hart, and I'm broadcasting from London this morning. It's 11 o'clock a.m. over here, and I've just woken up, and this morning we were going to have Max Spiers come on. Unfortunately, he's had to rush off to see to his younger brother's been hurt, so he's had to rush to the hospital to see that he's okay. So he is going to hopefully join us at 12 o'clock. That's 12 o'clock my time, because Max Spiers is actually a Brit, and he lives in this country, a long way from me, actually. He's in Canterbury in Kent, and I'm in London. So he's going to talk about different things. He's going to talk about time travel, portals, metaphysical programming on the people, and lots of fascinating stuff. Also this morning we hope to have popping in a man called Peter Moon, who used to belong to the Scientology cult, and he is going to talk about various things, including Scientology. Again, he's going to talk about mind control and just different technology now that the state has. Last week I interviewed Fritz Springmeier, which was pretty fascinating. The free link to that show is on my Facebook page, so please just send me a friend request. And Christine J. Hart, or Christine Joanna Hart, and no, it's Christine J. Hart on my Facebook, and you can get that link. So now, as my producer rang me this morning to wake me up, and here I am sitting in my little dressing gown. I haven't even had a sip of a cup of tea yet. And along was my good friend Douglas Dietrich, who is off to bed himself. He's padding around in his pajamas, clutching his little teddy bear that he told me he takes. Oh, there he is now. That he takes to bed with him every night, and he's agreed to join us for a little pre bedtime chat. Hello, Douglas. How are you over there in America?
Oh, I'm fine. If I were to have any teddy bear in my life, it would be some horror that would be similar to the comedy Ted, where they've got this grizzled, womanizing, cigar-smoking little, I guess you'd call it kind of like a homunculus or something like that, that's brought to life by this loser's wish because he's lonely as a child or something, and it winds up sticking with him as this kind of companion as they both mature and grow increasingly jaded and faded and sophisticated in their later years, or at least the teddy bear does, and the human has obviously maturation issues, which form the crux of the comedy. I understand that the sequel was quite the disappointment compared to the original, but nevertheless, it's a shall we say it's an amusing image, but hardly one that I can shall I say live up to. Now, Bates says that he has come through. He will be around in an hour. So that means, and this is through our lovely executrix producer, Laura Lee Solomon, that means that Max Spiers may yet be joining us. And if he does, more power to him. And I can help to, Peter's around too. We'll be bringing him on, and he can help to, kind of fill in airtime, because I'm just kind of like, shall I say, as spacey as Christine is, only she's kind of fading into the day, whereas I'm fading out. And we have with us, I believe, The ever exuberant Peter Moon. Can you hear us, good sir?
Yes, I didn't know you were going to be with us. What a surprise.
Oh, well, the more the merrier. It's kind of like, well, at any rate, the lady Christine Joanna Hart is not quite aware of whom you are. So what we can do is allow myself to kind of introduce you, and you can correct me wherever I go wrong. So Christine Joanna Hart, Mr. Peter Moon, is an investigative author. He has published at least, I would think, close to 24 books. Is that not the case, Mr. Moon?
Well, 21, I think the count is.
Wow. And so as a person who has published that many books, he's investigated quite a number of subjects. Most of these have been in the theme of the Montauk project and where that kind of takes us. And it takes us
Peter, sorry. Hi, it's Christine, waves across the ocean. How are you? Where are you, by the way, Peter?
I'm in Long Island. It's 6 o'clock in the morning here now.
In Long Island, is that near New York?
Yes, Long Island extends from New York about 120 miles into the Atlantic Ocean, where at the end is Montauk Point.
Oh, I see. Sorry, Douglas, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just wondered. What?
It's a good interruption.
I just wanted. Oh, go and cuddle that little teddy. It's a small teddy. It's like the guy off Brideshead Revisited. He walked around. Sebastian. Remember Sebastian? Does anyone know Sebastian?
Oh, don't know Sebastian.
Oh, you haven't seen the film? Oh, the film was the book Brideshead Revisited is very good. There's a guy who lives in this massive house and aristocracy, and he clutches this little bear all the time. Sebastian. Don't know. Never mind.
Okay.
So what were you doing at Montauk, Peter?
Well, the only thing I've ever done at Montauk is investigate and research and look. Never really social visits out there. I've had many visits. It's sort of like a third home to me. But anyway, I got involved with Montauk because of Preston Nichols. I had met Preston Nichols in 1990, and that was 25 years ago. This week I met him.
And who's he? Who's
Nichols. Well, I'm going to explain who Preston Nichols is. Preston Nichols was a scientist involved in strange experiments that took place at Montauk Point, an Air Force station called Camp Hero. And Preston not only was he a scientist, he had severe experiences with mind control, both as a perpetrator but also as a victim. He experienced what you might call alien abduction or takeaway, or and he comes back downloaded with a bunch of information that made him a genius compared to what he had been. He was already a genius, but he was even more so after having one of these experiences when he was a teenager.
And Preston Nichols, is he dead now?
No, he's not dead. He's been struggling with certain health issues. He's upstate in a place called Cairo, New York, named after the famous city in Egypt, which means Mars. Cairo means Mars, but they like to call it Cairo up there because they like to erase the memory of the past. It was once, well, anyway, that Preston is still alive, but he's been struggling with health issues. His mind is sharp, though.
Hang on a sec. What was it? What was the past they want to wipe out?
Oh, the whole memory of what took place here in America. You have a lot of Muslim names, like places like Cairo, Illinois, Cairo, New York, Memphis, Tennessee. I said Muslim names, but I actually mean Egyptian names.
Right.
And the the word, we had sheriffs here in the United States, or was called America, Sharif. This is a Islamic word. So there's a lot of history that took place here that's not really been acknowledged by the conquering white folk.
Why not?
Why not?
Yeah.
Well, why doesn't the U.S. Army and the politicians want to admit that Japan, didn't exactly lose the war in the way that the Americans teach us. The same reason. They're hiding things. They're hiding the truth. They're hiding power. It's all about
and what was the truth, that the Muslims had control of America before?
Well, the ancient name for America, where America comes from, they will teach you in history books that it came from Amerigo Vespucci, who was a navigator, supposedly a navigator, but after Amerigo. But no, it was it was named after Almaricanos. Almaricanos is what they call this place, El Morocco. There was an ancient, this was America was once part of the Sultanship of Morocco, the country of Morocco. And so you have, they had a red flag a Moroccan flag is red. They later had to put a green pentagram on it to distinguish it for maritime purposes, but it was originally a red flag, and it was known as Old Glory, and this was the cherry tree. It was known as the cherry tree. So when Washington chopped down the cherry tree, you've heard that story. I don't know if you've heard that story in the UK, but we grew up in America talking about George Washington could not tell a lie. And when he chopped down the cherry tree, his father said, he says, "Did you chop down that cherry tree, George?" He says, "I cannot tell a lie. I'm so honest." And so because he told the truth, his father didn't spank him. Now we know that George Washington has not been spanked by the history that we're given, but that cherry tree represented the Moroccan flag. It was known as the cherry tree. And as I said, it was also known as Old Glory. And they used this flag to round up the slaves with. So, this George Washington, we're all taught this fable of what a good man George Washington was, but he chopped down the cherry tree. So, in other words, there was a treaty between Morocco and the United States. This is the first treaty the United States ever signed with Morocco. And the problem with Morocco was that they were having their people enslaved in the United States, which first got underway with the Columbus journey. And that set the precedent for the triangular trade route. So the Sultan of Morocco was outraged. Now, if you go to Morocco, you do not see this prejudice of color that we have or had in America. But so anyway, you've got this ancient history of the Moors and having an influence here in Morocco, and this history being totally obfuscated and obscured. There were black people here before there were white people. They were not all brought over in the triangular trade route, although many of them were. So when George Washington chops down the cherry tree, one of the agreements made between the Secretary of State of the United States and Morocco was that there would be a quid pro quo. So if you're caught in Morocco with your pants down and you're an American, and I literally mean pants down, because Morocco, you would be slapped on the wrist and sent to the consulate and released. You could not be punished as an American in Morocco. So people like William Burroughs, the famous beat writer, would go to Morocco because they could get young boys. And this was, Morocco was hands off on Americans, but there's reciprocity in diplomacy. So if this goes back to the 1700s, so if you had a Moroccan in trouble in the United States, like a slave who was a Moroccan citizen and he was slaved, he could go to the White House and say, "I'm a Moroccan," and they'd have to let him go. The cherry tree, the chopping down of the cherry tree, was that George Washington knew about this. He helped arrange for the agreement. And the reason they made this agreement was because Morocco had seized people in the United States, because the United States would not let go of their slaves.
Right.
So basically what happened was George Washington knew this rule, but he would not make it known. So this was the chopping down of the cherry tree. He was not a truth teller, as we are told in school. So this is the tip of the iceberg. But George Washington, the first public works project he did commission was the lighthouse at Montauk Point. So it was a Masonic installation from day one. Montauk was, and it later accumulated much history. And this is, you asked a question and I gave you a mouthful, so I'll be quiet for a while here.
No, that's okay. I'm just Preston Nichols. So he worked at this Montauk. When did it first become a sinister little place where experiments went on?
Well, I think it goes back into history. It goes back into the time of Kaiser Wilhelm. And Kaiser Wilhelm had a pan-Germanic movement, and he had his fingerprints at Montauk with, as far as we know, early tunnels. There's plenty of tunnels out at Montauk, and they will attribute many of them to being rum-running tunnels if you get to question somebody. But no, they have tunnels under there that were used prior to that. The Kaiser was building an empire back in the 1800s, and this was all pre-World War I stuff that went on. So when you say sinister stuff going on goes back into the 1600s when they were trying to get the land away from the Indians, who were known as the Pharaoh family, claiming descendancy from Egypt. So there's treaties go back, and the treaties were and the court dockets with the Montauk base, where it is now, are replete with numbers like 666, or the docket numbers, the original date, the first sort of deed, if you could call it that, was signed. The real deed.
So is it a special place? Has it got special energy there?
Yes, it is. It's a sacred point. It's on the sacred point that dowsers and the like would recognize. Of course, you take this sacred energy and twisting it and turning it to your own ends is what it's all about. And this goes back. I mean, you have the Masons, but you have other secret forces, and this is but it actually can become a whole study in a diabolism.
And so there's like a portal there,
to say the least, and it connects to your country when we're talking about portals with Land's End, what they know as Land's End, and an area in Cornwall that there's a bunker right at the end that and there were cables going straight from Montauk to Land's End, and there was a big rock there that Aleister Crowley did a ritual on, according to his son, and not only according to his son, but it was done on August 12th, 1943, the famous or infamous day that the Philadelphia experiment was supposedly reached its peak experience. So this is like you have a connection between the two areas, and of course the British Empire being the ruling empire.
Right. And if I could reinforce and contextualize what Peter Moon is talking about, because Peter Moon has done so much work with the detail, it's often very difficult for him to articulate the outline of the forest. And what Peter Moon is talking about, it would be puzzling to many people who think that this guy is really going out on a limb and he's really being far out, but it's not the case at all. What he's talking about is the symbology and the cultural, shall we say, imprinting or overlay of a template that frames our misinterpretation of actual events. So when George Washington and his cherry tree mythos was developed and foisted upon the American consciousness and kind of presented to school children ever since then in our fledgling republic, what they're really trying to hide is that when they reestablished the federal offices from Philadelphia to Washington District of Columbia, which was, of course, named after George Washington and named after, of course, that other genocidal mass murderer, Christopher Columbus, the young Atlantic coastal republic of the United States was very soon forced into open engagement on the Mediterranean and in North Africa with the Barbary pirates. They suffered repeated boarding actions that were taken against vessels sailing under the American colors during slave raids that were instigated by the Turkish Sultanate and its satellite states. So these Americans that were taken into slavery by the Turkish Caliphate became a subject in which the American presidency under Thomas Jefferson was forced to basically recognize the Barbary nations by paying them tribute. So in order to avoid their merchantmen and passengers on their ships being taken into slavery, by paying this tribute, the United States recognized itself as a tributary of the Mamlaka, or the kingdom of Tripolitania, which was then later assimilated into the Berber nations of Libya. This is why Muammar Gaddafi felt such contempt for the Americans and was waging war against them, and why they ultimately had him killed was to try and overturn their submission hundreds of years ago to Islam underneath the caliphate of the Turks, and in terms of a successor state unto the nation of Libya. So all of this goes back to the Barbary pirates, and the Americans, of course, later waged a war against the Barbary kingdom on the side of Napoleon Bonaparte, who had invaded Egypt, had the Battle of the Pyramids that was ongoing to establish himself as basically an Oriental dictator, what is known as a despot, and he himself, in order to expedite the public acceptance of himself in that part of the world as their leader, converted to Islam, which is unknown to most people. As a matter of fact, his original attempt to commission himself as an officer was with the Turkish Empire, because no one would have him as an officer in their armies until the revolution that took place within France. Until that time, the conservative king of the Bourbon dynasty of France and the Austro-Hungarian Empire would not take his commission as an officer, so he tried to establish himself within the army of the Janissaries, or foreign legionnaires of the Turkish Muslim Caliphate. So all of this served him in good stead later when he conquered Egypt. The Americans cooperated with him as an ally in invading the nation of the Barbary Kingdom, and that's where we got the Marine Corps anthem, which sang "From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli." That's where that comes from. And the Marine Corps sword is, of course, a Mameluke sword. It is a Muslim crescentine kind of scimitar that the Marine Corps non-commissioned officers carry. So all of this is, of course, part of that hidden history. And in terms of the cables of which Mr. Moon speaks, these are actual transatlantic telephone cables that were laid on the bottom of the floor of the ocean floor bed about 100 years ago at this point. And they basically connected telephonically, of course, England to the United States for reasons of telegraphy, or telegraphing each other. Now, all of this, of course, factors into why the Egyptian stuff that is reportedly found in the Grand Canyon in the 1800s has been suppressed and hidden. It's all part of hiding this ancient Egyptian colonization of North America, wherein the Moors, of course, colonized much of the southern regions. And this is why all of the Mexicans today are very heavily genetically connected to the Mediterranean from their Moorish ancestry. My executrix producer, Laura Lee Solomon, knows, of course, many Mexican people. She lives in the southern region of Texas, where there's a huge Mexican population. Many of them have Moorish names. They, of course, are not indigenous peoples. The indigenous peoples are suppressed and basically subject to genocidal exterminatory campaigns by the Mexican people. And the indigenous people would be the Mayans in the Yucatan, various other areas in Mexico, whereas the conquering Mexicans are obviously much more hairy, which, of course, indigenous Americans are not. And they grow incredibly huge mustaches, which are known as bandito mustaches up here in the north in America. And their chest hair and their mustaches, all of this is a product of their Moorish background, along with their diet, such as garbanzo beans, etc. I mean, it goes down to the nuances that most Americans never even think of. So they truly are genetically Moorish. Their religion, of course, has been heavily Catholicized by the European Spaniards. And, of course, we have Felipe and Apache pretty much integrated into the Latino population as brought up in the text box by our executive producer, Laura Lee Solomon. So with that, dear lady, I'll turn it back to yourself to ask some more questions of Peter Moon about this subject.
Let me just make a slight articulation on this point. The Moors are often confused with the Spanish or the Spanish Moors, because the Moors moved into Spain partially from Mauritania. But the word Moor has a much deeper connotation than what we would classify it as, with that sort of Spanish influence, because it's much more ancient to the word. And I had to be educated on this by my Moorish friends. The word Moor actually derives from an Old Greek Mao Resh. Mao meaning the Egyptian word for cat, and Resh meaning head or king. So they would be the cat kings or cat heads, and they represented anciently, they identified with a cat, and that's the feminine energy. And in the ancient Egypt, the cat was the antidote to the serpent. That's just so that the Moorish identity is much more ancient than the Spanish influence. And even the Chinese have acknowledged that black people were in that region before the Asian form of humanity was. But that's
right.
Just the point I wanted to make.
Lovely. Thank you, Peter. But going back to Montauk, so Preston Nichols, he's not available to talk at the moment because he's in an old people's home, is he?
He's not in an old people's home. He's in his own home, but he can be challenging to reach. He's not impossible to reach.
Okay.
I'm sorry, Christy.
And what did you want to say, Douglas? It's not about history, is it?
No. I was just going to ask him about the Preston Nichols character. We know that he is highly eccentric and that his behavioral mannerisms seem almost intended to make himself as repulsive as possible, or at least very difficult to interact when it comes to baseline humanity and social normatives. He just seems to be quite out of line, and therefore almost he's not only difficult to reach, he's somewhat very difficult to tolerate.
Okay.
Yeah.
So anyway, what's his life story? What happened? They put him in this base. When did they decide it was going to be a place where they experiment on people? And of course, that Stuart Sverdlow was kept captive there or something. I mean, me as an English person, I don't know anything about this place. So,
okay, but Douglas was making another point there, or a question. What was it?
Oh, I was just saying that I believe that his behavioral mannerisms are a product of trauma, and so I was going to ask you concerning the mind control experimentation that was a large part of the Montauk project. Christine Joanna Hart might be interested in the experiments that were conducted there in that regard, and we'd like to know if you feel or are under the impression that this is one of the reasons why Preston Nichols is so warped in that sense.
Well, of course. Now, let me say something about Preston's earlier life. When and I learned this from his mother while she was still alive, and she sort of came out of a coma-like state of being to talk to me one morning. It was very strange, because I didn't realize that she hadn't been speaking to people. She called me into the house to talk. One of the things she told me, that when Preston was born, he couldn't talk until about the age of 4 or 5, when the doctor did an operation on his tongue. His tongue was attached to the roof of his mouth, and he was very smart, she said, but they had to clip his tongue, and then she said he was a chatterbox. He wouldn't shut up. And he was very intelligent. He was awkward, though, in terms of, like, he sort of had a palsy. And I could see it later in life when he would walk. I mean, he could walk. We walked long distances together at Montauk, but there would be a little bit of a palsy you could see in his biomechanics. But when he was very good with electronics, and he was an earlier did sound recordings and this sort of thing, but which is in a book called The Music of Time, his version of events. Now, when he got about age of 17 or so, he had these experiences where he was taken to what he called the Pleiades, and he came back, and his physical situation was much improved. He had a knowledge of electron. It was already high, but he went from, like, say, a batch, or the equivalent of a electronic genius to a super genius. And his father told me, and I asked his father, he called himself the doubting Thomas of all this. Although before he died, he did begin to believe much of Preston's stories. But he said that Preston came back with a much super knowledge. All of a sudden, he had a super knowledge of electronics that he did not have after this weirdo experience. Now, one of the things I want to mention in reference to what Douglas was stating is that I had a friend who said that she used to know Preston in the early 1980s. And she said that bar none, he was the most. Now, this woman was a stewardess for Pan Am. So and she attracted a lot of male attention in her day. So she said that bar none, the most handsome man she'd ever seen was Preston Nichols. Now, this is in the early 1980s when he used to go to the psychotronics chapter of the U.S. Psychotronics Association in New York City. Now, I attended that one time many years later. I was primarily at the Long Island chapter when I used to go. But she said he was incredibly good looking. I did see a picture of him from high school that would tend to back this up. I wouldn't call him the most handsome man, but he did not feature some of the characteristics that Douglas just alluded to in that photograph. He was not repulsive at all. So in 1983, when the Montauk project climaxed on August 12th, he had a sudden change. And all of a sudden, his care of self began to lose it. This is so in other words, something happened to him that discombobulated his, what you might call, social self. And when I came to him, he was unemployed. He'd been cast off by AIL, Airborne Instruments Laboratory, which was his primary employer, not his sole employer, but his primary, where he actually worked. And he was left to drift. Had he been taken care of by them or the military-industrial complex, he would probably not have been so inclined to spill his guts about what he remembered of the Montauk project. But
right, Peter, hang on a sec. I'm completely lost here. I mean, I'm completely, I'm lost. So, yeah. I still don't know what Montauk is and how it came to be this mysterious place where, so I've heard, experiments went on, and I don't know where Preston plays a part in that and when they hired him. So can we just do a potted history of how Montauk became to be this place where Stuart Sverdlow was kept kidnapped, and and was it run by the military, and what was it? If you can draw me a picture.
Well,
yeah.
The Montauk project, now, first I want to give the context of this. The Montauk project, and what we know of it, was initially, the information was collected from the personal experiences and recollections, some of it done under Reichian therapy, of Preston Nichols in conjunction with Duncan Cameron. And then there were also, I guess, what you call a satellite people that were involved in it that Preston talked to and collected information. So when I came to him, what I got was a synthesis of all this according to Preston's research. And some of it might be a little skewed. Some of it is spot on. But it was a synthesis, and he was the only one who had synthesized it, and then what I was able to do was decipher it to the best of my ability and present it as his story in a way that is intelligible It doesn't mean you have to agree with it, but you can at least understand what is being said. Now,
And you did that in a book, did you?
a book called The Montauk Project's Experiments in Time, which is available on Kindle and or my website, skybooks.usa.com.
Okay,
Now,
can you tell me the name of the book again? Just a bit slower. The Montauk what?
The Montauk Project Experiments in Time.
Okay.
Now, that book basically starts out with a small chapter on the Philadelphia experiment, which occurred in 1943 when the Navy was trying to make a ship appear invisible to radar. Now, there was a lot of things that went into that experiment. It wasn't just trying to make a ship invisible to radar. And we could talk all about the different agendas at work, but basically what's important to this discussion is that the ship did disappear, and with accompanying that disappearance, the sailors aboard it were discombobulated mentally, spiritually, and physically, some bursting into flame, some amalgamating themselves into the bulkhead. And so there was a human factor study done after that, which was primarily done at a place called Camp Upton, which was a World War I base during World War out in Long Island. Now, Camp Upton would evolve later into a place known as Brookhaven National Laboratories. So the research on these sailors, which were called the human factor studies, were very involved. They included the documents, a study of the documents, the captured German documents, and the research that was done by Joseph Mengele and others on the human being. And it involved also involved the work of Wilhelm Reich and the orgone energy that he categorized. It involved the modern computer, the father of which, the American, at least we've learned that there was an earlier computer in Germany from Douglas, but there was the American computer evolved from the work of John von Neumann, who was was the project manager of the Philadelphia experiment, and also involved in the early studies at Brookhaven, which was to get the mind of man registering on a computer, and with analyzing the relationship between the human mind and radio frequency. So this was later evolved out, and there's a whole story that goes with it, but it evolved into research that took place out at Montauk, because at the Air Force Station out there, they had a huge radar installation, which was called SAGE radar, and it emitted a frequency of approximately 435 megahertz, which Preston had identified with the window frequency to the human consciousness. And so they could amplify an individual's energy, like a psychic sitting in what was called the Montauk chair, to influence the moods of human beings out in society. And this is basically an overview. As more research would happen, they would be able to, these psychics, according to the stories, would be able to manipulate matter itself and eventually time.
So who was it, Peter, that thought of the window frequency to human consciousness? Who was that? Mengele's experiments, or right?
Not Mengele, but this was what this research was would have been figured out in the 1950s at Brookhaven Labs. Now, I will point out that Brookhaven Labs is, they're the ones that, I don't know if they discovered it, but they certainly were the early promulgators of microwave technology. So this is where microwave technology evolved out of, now Douglas might have earlier knowledge of what was going on in Asia as well. I don't know, but as far as the Americans concerned, microwave technology evolved at Brookhaven.
And that was close to Montauk, and Montauk had an Air Force base.
Well, an Air Force station. It wasn't an Air Force base. It was an Air Force station, because at Montauk they had this whole system of radar around the United States that was designed to pick up. It was early warning radar. Say if we were being attacked by Russia or another country, they would pick it up. Now, they would also pick up anything else in the skies out there. And they had underground installations out there where, to preserve the data they were recording. And there was a whole network. And Montauk, of course, was a part of this network. The main hub, it was in New Jersey. I forget the name of the base, but the main hub was in New Jersey.
And the first time that you heard about people doing, well, where did you hear about the Philadelphia experiment? That came out, did it? That was leaked about what happened?
There was a book on that in the 1974. Interestingly, authored by William Moore and Charles Berlitz. And Charles Berlitz basically put his name on it. He was a famous author from the Bermuda Triangle. Moore has got a much more dubious and sketchy history. He released the MJ-12 documents, which are certainly controversial and dubious in themselves. And he released some of the information of a man named Carlos Allende, or Carl Allen, who was a very curious character in himself, who was one of the first people to speak about the Philadelphia experiment and contacted a man named Morris Jessup. That goes back into the 50s, who was a scientist who wrote a book called The Case for the UFO. That's some of the earlier history of this information leaking out. So the Philadelphia experiment did take place. We don't have to rely completely on William Moore and his sketchy, dubious history, because there are other corroborative elements. But what was your question again? Because you asked about.
Yeah. What do you think went on there? You said you don't want to get into the agendas, but what do you think?
I didn't want to get into the agendas. I said there's a whole long diatribe that one could get involved in.
Right. And to clarify this, Christine, what Peter Moon is talking about, because again, he's dealt with so much detail and with so many witnesses that he's had to have a conversation with. I'm not going to use the word interrogate, but rather interview. And he's had so many strange experiments with their families, such as the mother of Preston Nichols, who was basically comatic most of her life and suddenly emerged.
No, not most of her life. Not most of her life. No, she wasn't.
Yeah, and then suddenly emerged to speak to him more cognizantly. All of that adds to impressions that he gets that are very intense. So he gets into a lot of these stories in so many different books that, to put it more, shall I say, contextually for you in a kind of synopsis, what I can tell you is that we were dealing with a kind of torsion tensor kind of physics that was first developed or formulated by Nikola Tesla. And what he presented to the Undersecretary of the Navy during World War I, that's why it's so important that so much of this was dealing with World War I basing. He presented to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was the Undersecretary of the Navy at the time during World War I, the idea of torpedo deflection, because the Germans had developed the submarine as an offensive weapon during World War I. So Tesla said that by rotating magnetic fields that could be projected from a ship, they could deflect torpedoes. Now, he knew, of course, that there was much more that would be collateral to this in terms of its impact because of work that was being done in World War II by the National Socialistische concerning hyperdimensional rotational physics in what became known as the National Socialistische, or the Nazi Bell. And now, the physicist David Anderson, who has worked very heavily with Peter Moon, decided that they could manipulate small portions of time.
Hang on, who worked with him? Who?
Peter Moon has been working to an extent or interviewing Mr. David Anderson, who was said by Al Bielek, who was, shall we say, for lack of a better word, a victim of collateral damage of the Philadelphia experiment on the USS.
So he's working on it now, or he did work on it with his book with this David Anderson chap?
Well, David Anderson is someone who's still working on time travel, or at least the ability to manipulate small portions of time via rotation lasers. So he has.
Does that mean, Douglas? Does that mean like teleporting?
It could perhaps. I mean, obviously, Mr. Moon would speak to that at a greater level, but to just kind of leave it with the Philadelphia experiment, shall we say, parameters. Al Bielek, who was collaterally a victim or directly a victim of the USS Eldridge and what took place upon it, was someone who felt that the Anderson family was kind of like a military dynasty that helped to manage time manipulation. And all of this might be interpreted as a mind control kind of cascade memory, which was impacted onto Mr. Bielek, just as one might interpret much of Mr. Preston Nichols' memories to be a memory cascade, or kind of like a download from a mind control program, so that their memories would be so warped, even on their own retrieval, that people couldn't interpret what they were saying in a coherent fashion. Now, this could be used to hide scientific secrets that they wanted to prevent the public from accessing in an individual like Preston Nichols, or in the case of Al Bielek, it could be to prevent a actual event from being accessed by the general public in a fashion that they would find believable, because Al Bielek's story was so unbelievable in so many ways. But primarily, we have this concept with the USS Eldridge and the magnetic fields that were being generated by very heavy mechanisms that were implanted onto the ship itself. Primarily, it was for projectile deflection. Secondarily, it was radar stealth, because the ship would essentially become invisible quite physically, as well as onto radar. Tertiarily, that was the optical invisibility that was a tertiary collateral effect that nobody expected, due to the fact that they were trying to become invisible to radar. So, in other words, you had this entire effect that also led to the damage of the ship itself in terms of the molecular structure of the ship. When Mr. Moon is talking about the amalgamation of the sailors with the hull of the ship itself, they melted into the ship. They became part of the metal bulkhead, as what happened to the brother of Al Bielek.
That's depressing, isn't it? So where are they? Is there any like souvenirs of that in a museum or something? Or?
Well, the ship itself, they've just cut the bodies out from the bulkhead, and then they turned the ship over. If I remember correctly, it was either sold to a foreign nation, the Greeks, who bought a lot of ships that were decommissioned from the U.S. military, or it was the whole project was dumped onto the U.S. Coast Guard, which is still a branch of the military, but they got it out of the hands of the Navy. But because of what happened with the experiment achieving unexpected results, we had the situation that so appalled Einstein, who was also involved with the project, that he retracted his unified field theory in the fear of what it would lead to if further research was done with it. I mean, that's how impacting this was. But in terms of Nikola Tesla, he refused to work with weaponizing hyperdimensionality in the first place, and that's why ultimately he suffered all of the retraction of his citizenship. His citizenship was revoked. He wound up killing himself, and this was to prevent the United States military from literally interning him and forcing him, torturing him into working with the project. But
who killed himself, Douglas?
Nikola Tesla.
Okay.
And at least he died on his own terms. At the time that he died, his United States citizenship had been revoked, and the FBI was coming to arrest him, to take him into internment, where he would have been tortured as a citizen who was no longer a citizen, as an enemy alien who was now an enemy of the state, and forced to cooperate with the workings of the USS Eldridge, the Philadelphia Project. And all of this, of course, had to do with weaponizing hyperdimensionality. What the National Socialistes, or the Germans, were working with was later became known as Bell technology, or the Nazi Bell. But what the Americans were working with was present and manifest at Montauk. Now, this was all laid out in tetrahedral geometry by a kind of, shall we say, what Einstein became originally familiar with was through his Jewish culture and the Star of David. That's a two-dimensional analog of two tetrahedrons. Now, this dovetails into, of course, the Ark of the Covenant and various other concepts that they had of its hyperdimensionality that Peter Moon has also written about. Now, all of this, of course, goes into what he was speaking with resonance and sound projection and how this affects people's consciousness. All of this I'm familiar with through, of course, my liaison under orders through the Department of Defense with Colonel Michael Aquino. Now, Aquino's teachings encourage the cultivation of latent powers of personality locked in the minds of a few potential supermen that could be released through music resonating at 3 to 7 cycles per second. This was a notion that was born of his work with Army psychological warfare and psychotronics. It was also something that either emerged from or became, shall we say, absorbed into the contemporary human potential movement at a time when the brain machine was being mass marketed as a tool for achieving hypnotic and other altered states of consciousness through pulsed light and sound stimulation. Ultimately, this is what is said or is determined to have led to the suicide of one of the great rock stars of the era who was involved with Throbbing Gristle, or I can't remember which band he was a part of, but all people need to look up is a book on the Dream Machine. I forget the title of it, but my executive producer, Laura Lee Solomon, was
by
able
Brian
to...
Geisen? The Dream Machine by Brian Geisen?
I believe so, yes. He spoke of the suicide of the rock star who was very much addicted to the Dream Machine, and as was
so isn't the David Anderson character? He's quite interesting, isn't he?
Well, yes, but let me just say something, if I may, because Douglas, he elicits so much information, and it's very fast, and he's contextualizing what I'm saying. The same time, I want to contextualize what he's saying, or what we're all doing here, because he alluded to Aquino, but you see, the Montauk Project, there were 3 versions of it, because that's a colloquial name, but the earlier name was Phoenix, and Phoenix was the project that, to my understanding, and I'm not an expert on this area, but in Vietnam, where they were using, and Douglas has talked about this in quite a bit on his other YouTubes and whatnot, and interviews he's done, but the mechanics of sound. Now, this predated the Montauk Project as we know it in the 1970s. So I would be very surprised if Preston Nichols did not know of Aquino, on a deep level, and has some connections there, which he may or may not be able to dredge up if I get the opportunity to talk to him about it. But I want to say that with all the research that I did on the Montauk Project, it's all contextualized if one has the opportunity or takes the opportunity to read all of the books. It's a contextualization of me trying to find coherency with all this wild data that Preston gave us, and it goes deep into occultism as well. So it's all a matter of trying to connect the dots. But when I got to a certain point, I realized that all arrows pointed to San Francisco and the Presidio. I arrived at this partially from my limited personal experiences in that city, but also a book I wrote called Spandau Mystery, which is a novel where I was trying to get at answers because I wasn't getting answers by normal research threads. And of course, eventually I would meet Douglas in San Francisco, and he was was sort of the boomerang end of this for me. Now, of all of this research that has taken place, which is, there's just so much of it. But what I want to say now, and you were asking about Dr. David Anderson, right now I actually am reorganizing my entire iteration of what I have to offer, and I'm going to be integrating this. Douglas and I are going to be collaborating together to a certain extent here, and with the help of Andrew Bartzies. And I'm going to begin my own dissemination of some of this information with some of the cogent facts that David Anderson has to relay about the mechanics of time travel, or the foundational mathematics and physics of it. I just completed my first video on this. When it gets released, I'm not sure, but it will be very soon. And this idea of time moving forward, this will be a whole internet iteration of things. It's a new iteration of what I've done. And I hope to integrate Douglas into this as well so we can contextualize this, because so much of this information comes like this is the age of information. It just starts like hitting you like arrows. And it's we have to slow it down and reiterate it to a new audience, a new world, and bring it out. So anyway.
So that, Peter, is in your book. You were saying that it goes into the deep occultism and also all arrows pointing to the Presidio. Is that in your book? Is that all in your book?
No, I haven't written. The only thing I've written about of the Presidio is in maybe a newsletter or two, because I do a quarterly newsletter called the Montauk Pulse. But no, I have not written about the Presidio at all. That's Douglas' department. And I do hope to do a book with Douglas. This is a whole thing we haven't had time to talk about.
Right. Right.
And what did you mean? I think we're going to go to break shortly. Can you guys, Peter and Douglas, stay with me? We're bringing on Max Spiers. Can you stay with me for the last hour? Douglas, are you tired?
Of course.
Is it bedtime? No.
Yeah. And I do want to emphasize before we go to break that the book that I was alluding to was titled The Chapel of Extreme Experience, A Short History of Stroboscopic Light and the Dream Machine. It was published in 2003, and the author was John Geiger, Geiger, for anyone who's interested. And he traced the history of how the visual phenomena was first described 200 years ago by Dr. Perkin. And Perkin, was a famous doctor of the time who described how the visual brain worked, and this became something that impacted contemporary artistic and musical culture to the point where many rock stars who did die of suicide, it was blamed on this machine. So we'll be back.
See you after the break. Hi, we're back on air, and I hope you're joining us over there in America. You're waking up and get some coffee down you. We've got a really fascinating show today. I'm Christine Joanna Hart. I'm broadcasting from London at the moment. I'd just like to say, if you like my shows and want to keep me on air, my PayPal account is warnernews@sky.com. That's warnernews@sky.com. And any donations, I'll be really grateful to keep me on air. Today's show, we're covering all kind of things. We're covering, we started at Montauk, and because I have some really fascinating intellectual men on the show, I have 3 very clever intellectual men on the show, and we're having a mixed pot of discussion. We started off with Montauk with our guest, Peter Moon, who has written some absolutely fascinating books. One of them is on the Montauk project, and he is currently working on a book at the moment about David Anderson, time travel, and the Philadelphia experiment. So that should be, and that should be absolutely fascinating. And also Douglas Dietrich, who I have appeared on his radio show on Revolution Radio, talking about when he was in the army and mind control experiments. We all seem to have moved into an interesting point. Mr. Peter Moon was talking about his investigations into Montauk and his investigations into the Philadelphia experiment, and he made the interesting point that all arrows drew back to the Presidio. I don't know much about the Presidio, so I'm going to ask one of the guys I have with me to go over what that actually is, what the Presidio actually is. And he mentioned a man called Colonel Michael Aquino, and I know Mr. Dietrich will be on in a minute to discuss what his dealings were when they were in Vietnam together. My experience with Michael Aquino, or Aquino, how they say it in America, I've got to know him via email. I know him quite well. He agreed to come on the show, but I don't know if the studio bosses would actually like him to come on the show. When I had dealings with him, he did come to me astrally, and he did do a lot of pulling me out of my body and all kinds of stuff. And when I put it to him over email, he just kind of made a joke out of it. We're also very, very lucky to have with us Max Spiers today. Max, you had a problem with your mother, didn't you? And your brother. I'd like to say welcome to the show. And how is your brother, Max? Hello, Max, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Oh, there he is. Good.
Yeah. Hi, Christine.
Oh, hi. How are you, Max?
Hi.
How is your brother?
That's all good. That's fine. It was unexpected, pulled out of nowhere, so I had to go and deal with that. But I'm in a position where I can speak, and I can get Skype on my phone and talk to you, and we can do this. So everything's okay.
Excellent.
Yeah. So I mean, Peter Moon. I'm a huge fan of Peter Moon. So it's amazing that you had him on today. I've been fascinated by his writing and his work, and a lot of the ways he thinks parallels my own. It's Presidio, by the way, Christine. The Presidio. In San Francisco, right. Yeah, right. It was a daycare center, an area.
A daycare for children?
Yes, it's an area of San Francisco where some satanic ritual abuse was going on in San Francisco. I'm not the expert on Presidio. I just know people who have had connections to it, and the Kindercare. There's a big children's daycare center in the United States called Kindercare, Kindercare, and the symbol for Kindercare is basically, it's not hard to see that it's a pyramid with the capstone lifting at the top, and multiple stories have come out of Kindercare, which sort of parallel again like Presidio in San Francisco. Bush funding has gone into Kindercare too, so their money is behind that. So I'm just sort of jumping in where you were at, so I can join in and add my own piece.
Yeah. Well, welcome to your show. I have listened to Max Spiers. If you can Google him and listen to him on many radio interviews. He's a fascinating man. He's an experiencer of metaphysical phenomena since a child. He's a numerologist, an astrologer, and he decodes the mind control in modern television and media. He breaks down the symbolism, the communication to the subconscious that has been embedded into humanity throughout the 20th century, and predictive programming in modern culture. And really, I've listened to your stuff, Max, and I'm a great fan. So anyone out there, please Google him, and just he's on Facebook. You find him there as well, and he will let you know what interviews he's been on. But well done, Max, and fantastic stuff.
Thank you, Christine. It's funny. The more that I look into, the more that you kind of search for these things, the more they keep popping up. Once you hit a trail, then all of a sudden clues keep jumping out more and more and more. It's funny how the universe just kind of tells you the truth wherever you go, if you're looking for it and looking through the right eyes. It's telling you all the answers all around you all the time.
Yeah, interesting. And Douglas Dietrich here, he said to me, he just give me a little text message. Yeah. To say that you had experiences with Colonel Aquino. As you know, you've probably heard of my experiences with him. He kept pulling me out of my body for about a week, and all sorts of stuff.
So if you look at his name, if you look at his last name, okay, he doesn't pronounce it how the South American pronunciation. He doesn't pronounce it Aquino, which is how it should be pronounced. He pronounces his own name Aquino. So it begins with A, which is the alpha, ends in O, which is the omega. So the beginning and the end, with the queen in the center, which is the negative feminine. So he represents the negative feminine binding the masculine within the planet to withhold it, to have a manipulation over it. They're lowering the bar of debauchery and negativity to such a point that it breaks the human heart, so they will be completely malleable.
Right, that's interesting. I'm noticing, Max, on television, these days it gets more and more violent, and it's not just, thrillers and hammer horror, but if you're watching, there's that Jewish comedian, Amy Schumacher, you're watching, I was watching her, she's really funny, but then you're watching all of a sudden someone's getting their neck slit open, or there's blood. It's
so like, what they do, yes, totally. What they do is they'll put clever comedy in there to draw certain people because she's going to draw a certain type of mind because it's intelligent comedy. And then when they've drawn the people to it, then they will, in addition, weave vile. They're always talking about why in every TV show or talk show, why are they always talking about feces now? Why is it always connected with that? Why are they always talking about that? It's like they're embedding it or conditioning people to accept more vile versions of what sexuality is, to invert the real nature of what it is. Essentially, so the new world, the new agenda is a total inversion of what natural creation is. If you could imagine a flower growing and opening, they are trying to do it so it's the death of the flower and the withering and wilting and dying.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, I underwent primal therapy in Los Angeles with Arthur Janoff, and there were lots of. I was very best friends with. I love gay men. I really get on with them very well.
Yeah.
And he treated homosexuality in both male and female as a neurosis, and he sort of treated it. And lots of the gay men said, "Oh, I don't really like it." But I think now in society, it's like, you kind of being gay is really, really fashionable. You know, you don't ever look at it and think, well, is it because I didn't have enough close contact with my father or my mother, but it's sort of rammed down. If you feel that, then you're gay, and to go with it. But I think everybody has, attractions to the opposite sex, now and again, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're gay. But I think that is now rammed at us, isn't it, to the children?
Completely and utterly, and also it's conditioning. There is very specific ways to induce magnetism from male to male, that certain rituals and things are done from childhood so that when you have the adult, that they're going to be drawn more to it through some nasty ways of doing it. I mean, to make males be drawn to males, because there was an agenda also which is connected to throwing a few names out. John Scarlett, who was an ex-MI6 director, and Stella Rimington, who was the ex-MI5 director, and a number of others. Some of these men had an idea that they wanted to completely get rid of the female gender completely, and wanted to place wombs inside males so that males could have babies, so that the female, which is the template for compassion and regeneration and growth, like that would be wiped out. And that they could just maintain birth through males and maintain the negative male energy, which is negative male energy is war, is a gun, is explosion. Negative female energy is behind the scenes, poison, underground. Under the water is female, above the water is male. So there is a big push to get rid of the positive feminine energy that needs to thrive through the earth to make it grow and continue to grow outward. If that makes sense, I'm trying here.
Yeah, it does. I've always thought, I've investigated serial killers, over my life, and I've always thought that the serial killer energy was a feminine energy. I've met Yankee and I've met Brady. They're incredibly feminine men. It is.
Because negative male is put a gun to your head and fire.
Yeah.
Negative female through a male would be secrets, would be portraying yourself as one thing and then acting another way behind the scenes. That's the double-headed eagle that they use in Freemasonry, which symbolizes I present this way to the public, but in fact I am this way behind the scenes. That's why they use masks all the time in rituals. Why is a mask so important? Because a mask is symbolic and representative of as a facade, as a pretense. So you're not that. You're in fact this thing behind it. Masks come up over and over again. Cracked mirrors and masks are used all the time as symbolic triggers too.
Oh, that's interesting because I don't know why I was interested in studying serial killers, but my mother was very much presenting, a happy, wonderful person to the public, and yet behind the scenes, she was quite, into beating me, and she was sexually abusive, and a horror story, a bit like a serial killer. And then I went to study serial killers. Why are they like that? And people said, well, your mother was mean to you, and they're men, but actually, no, they're like women. It's
Well, a lot of these serial killers are groomed and programmed at the military-industrial bases, and set out the mainstream ones, the ones that Bundys, the Gacy's, etc., are all set like Bruce Jenner was set to. That was to imprint on the subconscious of the people that look how powerful we are. We can take out a gold medal winning athlete and turn him into a woman. So that impact on the subconscious of the male says, well, look how easily we can be turned. If it can be an athlete can be turned, then anybody can. That impacts the subconscious of every male on the planet. So I'm just sort of tying that in with that too.
What does so the serial killers? What do they impact on the subconscious?
It would depend on each one because each of them are different. But
say Kenneth Bianchi, who strangled women and then left them naked in the middle of the town for everyone to see.
Okay, so I don't know specifically about him, but I do know that out of the hundreds of thousands of children that over the years that have been taken and from specific bloodlines and attempted to be programmed, MK program, 98% will malfunction or completely become vegetables or die. The few that do manage to survive, they will then put them because they're doing one massive ritual. So if you can look at the 20th century as one giant ritual, so they're looking at each year or each decade or the specific months of the specific names of the people to be placed and to these killings at certain times. So it's a script. It's a script, and so they create their characters through trauma-based mind control, and then they continue the ritual through making it look like it's a series of random events when in fact it's the most calculated script that's ever been.
Oh, I see. Interesting. Where do you get all your information from, Max? Because sometimes I feel like you're almost channeling it from somewhere. Do you have a sort of deeper part of yourself that you when you're speaking, you let it come through you?
That's okay. Yes. So I have been through experiences myself. So I've been through specific rituals too. Sometimes I'm able to access information and just go and just speak, and it's there. And I don't know where it is coming from. So I think I am channeling it some of the time. And then other times I am completely blank and I can't say anything. Almost like, okay, so I see it in my head. I see how they have compartmentalized experiences, information, and I can see when I go to get the information, sometimes there's a door or a gatekeeper, and the door is locked. So I'm seeing it in my mind's eye. I can't go through it, so I can't access the information. And so that's how I do it. I do a lot of visualization, and then when I walk through the door, or I walk down the stairs, or I see a specific color, then the information comes with that.
Oh, that's fascinating, because I noticed you when I watched you speaking. It was almost you were like definitely reaching another part of you, and kind of it was almost like watching someone channel, and you were speaking, and I know what you were saying was truthful, and I was like, yeah, I really want that information that you're coming out with.
Yes.
And I just thought, that you were channeling it, and it was, and there was an interviewer asking you a question, and it's almost like another part of you turned as if to say, not shut up, but you said, yes, I'll get onto that, and it was like another part of you, almost a robotic, would say, yes, I'll get into that, and then you carried on, clicked into this kind of information coming through you.
I think I created because of certain traumatic events, guardians that sort of step forward, and then if something is going to put me, or a question or something is going to put me into a position where a memory might come up or something might be uncomfortable with me to deal with, a guardian sort of comes in and won't allow it. So I think I created Guardians to so that I wouldn't sort of lose it, really, because in 2008, when I knew that I was entrenched in this stuff. I knew that I was. I've always known that. But in 2008, when I turned 31. A lot of memories bled through all at the same time. So what it did is it turned my perception of what my life was upside down. It didn't make any sense. None of the things made any sense to me anymore. And so I went through a period of a year where I sort of lost my identity. And identity of self is so much about connected to how you create the reality that's around you. What you believe you are, you're sort of the imagination of yourself. So then you're the imagination of yourself, and then you're wandering through your subconscious. And if somebody can have access to that, which is symbols, sigils, glyphs, right brain speaking, if somebody has the information of how to communicate to that part of the brain, then they can manifest your life in the way that they want you to have it, and not how you want to have it. And that works on a collective level as well. They're using Hollywood as the holy wood of illusion to project and condition to the subconscious on a mass level, global level. Then they can manifest any reality that they want. Not any. Because there are people that what I've seen also is that there are seemingly so going to Hollywood, opposing directors. There seems to be infighting going on. So you'll have I think the director of the movie is the hands-on sort of creator, but not necessarily the mind behind the final product. Like, for example, perhaps Michael Aquino would be the mind, and then he would explain to a specific director, this is how we wanted to come out, and then they would work in collaboration. So the magician Aquino would be behind the scenes doing it, but it would be seemingly that the director was doing it. And then perhaps 6 months later, another director would come in who opposes that, and then would embed something which opposes the original message from the director. So it's sort of like they're playing black magic wars through cinema screens, through movie theater screens.
That's interesting. I noticed my own mind control. I wasn't sure whether I was or not. Fritz confirmed it that I was, and of course Douglas Dietrich has confirmed it I was, and they're the experts, and of course yourself. But I also had that subconscious, like, when I went to have the affair with the real IRA commander, and I think spied on them for the state. It was like it came as an idea, and it was like, oh, read books about the IRA. That'll be interesting. Yeah. Just arrived like that, that kind of suggestive, and I went with it because, boy, that was exciting, and I was just lying around doing nothing anyway,
Yes, yeah, and so that works the same, and that principle works the same way when they tried in the 60s and 70s to flash up a can of Coke in a movie theater at one frame. Only on one frame, so the conscious mind doesn't pick it up. Then they found out that Coke sales went up 80%. Then it was all go from there. That if you speak to the subconscious, then so you're driving along the freeway, and then all of a sudden you don't know why, but you feel like you want a Coke, or you feel like you want this. It's because it's been layered there. So with that potential, you can all of a sudden somebody becomes interested, like you said, in reading up about this, that, or the other, and you don't know why. Well, there's a very specific reason why. I think we've been given the appearance of free will, but not actually free will. Yes,
we're not free will. Like, even when I discussed the phone hacking in MI6, I had a weird kind of dust attack in the town, and then I had some weird kind of communication when I was like sleeping in a lucid dream that said, you can't talk about MI6 and the phone hacking and the press controlled by the state. Or we'll give you a stroke. And it was just like a thought. And I thought, how free, how free are we as citizens? We're free if we're like the people in my village, you just have dinner parties, you think about Waitrose food, house prices going up, and you stay in the pen, then you're free. You try and step outside it and you're completely shot down, completely.
Exactly. Well, people who are doing that, worrying about house prices, coming back to watch EastEnders, making sure they're doing that, are no problem whatsoever to the system in any way. anyway. So let's, from their point of view, from the elite's point of view, let them continue doing that. That isn't that. Maybe give them more. Maybe make them become more entrenched in doing that, because at that point they're there's no problem. It's the people that are telling and speaking out and saying to you, hey, this is a game. Literally, there's a game going on here, and there's very, very clearly an agenda, and we're being pushed, and it seems to be sped up over the last 6 months. They're pushing so hard now, almost as if like there's a window open, and if they don't, they're trying to get it. They're trying to reset again to the old ways of doing things, with the master-slave reality, with the elite top-down hierarchy and the slaves at the bottom, to recycle again another cycle of that, when we don't want to. I mean, I think there are multiple people on this planet who, like I think I've said before, that who've chosen to do it again, and to do that again, and haven't learned the lessons of that, and will continue to do that. But there are a small percentage of people who've come down here as volunteer consciousness to say, hey, you're being fooled. They're drawing in more, that through sex and through sex magic, and they're drawing in more and more powerful. Doesn't matter whether it's dark or light, being brought in here, because they're trying to create conflict. They're trying to maintain and keep the conflict going. So if they can draw a very powerful quote-unquote light being down as well, and a very powerful dark being, the conflict will then continue. So it's not as if they need to maintain conflict to maintain duality. If there's no conflict, if there's no up, down, left, right, then there's no duality anymore. And that means we fall into, we move out of this sort of like hole.
And what did you, and I'll come to you, Peter, I know you're upset, you want to talk about Aquino, but one second, you were saying, Max, the attack on the human heart, and you said they were doing something, what did you say? They were just to degrade us to a certain point where the human heart is waxed out.
The heart, the human heart, is the thing that's in the way of completely taking over control here. It's very easy to enter and control like the root chakra or the base chakra, because everything is running on that. But to break the human heart is then to be able to have kind of full control, and that's what they're doing. I mean, they've done it. There's so many different ways that they've been doing it. I'd like to hear what Peter has to say too. I'd like to, hear that.
Yeah. No, he said it was Douglas. Douglas, are you there?
Oh, yes. Yeah, and I'm really glad to be on with Max Spiers. So good to be with you again, good sir. Hope to.
What's up, Doug? How are you?
Yeah, well, definitely. I'm just glad to be speaking to you after all this time. We've both been through quite a bit. And,
that's for sure.
Believe me.
I've known Douglas for a while. Douglas and I have known each other and met up over the last few years, quite a few times. We spent Thanksgiving together the year before last. Yes.
Yes, and please give my love to the lovely Sarah as well.
I certainly will.
Yeah,
sure.
I mean, gosh, I miss her, and certainly we've all been through a lot, and because of that shared experience, I'm hoping that I can bring up a little bit more out of Max that he may not consciously remember. I'm going to try and do this in as, shall we say, as contextual a way as possible so that it comes out softly. But I'm glad that you admire Peter Moon. Peter Moon's a great guy, and he mentioned while you were talking about the name of Aquino and how he likes to pronounce it with a queen in the middle of the alpha and the omega. You are absolutely right. That's exactly what he had always stated. And like Peter Moon has observed right here in the text box, basically he's also saying he's a queen. And that's exactly,
Douglas, I think that he might, he possibly, I don't know, is he androgynous? Is he a hermaphrodite?
He's a cross-dresser, and what happened was in the summer of 1987 when my commercial illustration instructor, Gary Willard Hambright, was arrested for sodomy and various other assaults on a 3-year-old boy, it was brought to the attention by over 100 children initially that reported to both the FBI and police through interrogations that they were brought to Aquino's home at 2430 Leavenworth, where they were brought into a black room, entirely painted black, with a cross on the ceiling that was painted onto the ceiling in this heretical fashion. And the people who assaulted them were Gary Willard Hambright, my commercial illustration instructor from the old John O'Connell Vocational Institute in San Francisco, and of course Colonel Michael Aquino, who was the owner of the home at that point, a lieutenant colonel, and his wife Lilith. And it was reported that both men were dressed as women, and Lilith Aquino was dressed as a man.
Inversion.
Of course, and of course everybody in the military called him Aquino to disempower him, because of course they didn't want him basically using his feminine mojo upon them. So that was their way of keeping him at bay. Now, one of the things that I'll segue into was we were talking about the work that was conducted with sound, and Christine Joanna Hart brought up the Vietnam War. In June of 1969 is when Aquino embarked on his tour of duty in Vietnam with the 6th PSYOP Battalion and the 3rd Corps Tactical Zone in South Vietnam, and was in this capacity that the United States Army was already working with helicopters that flew overhead with stereo equipment.
Just real quickly, Douglas, if you June of '69, okay, so you have two things there that are significant. Okay, June becomes the month of Cancer, right? It's Cancerian, which is the moon. 1969, the 6-9 is the glyph for Cancer. So you've got two specifics implementing the moon or implying the moon, so negative feminine again. I think everything that he does is ritualistic, and there's another glaringly obvious one.
Yes, though in that case he was deployed via the ritualism of his superiors during that day, at that period of time. And of course I had not served with him in Vietnam. I was simply not, I'm not that old, Christine, as much as my looks may get people an impression otherwise. But nevertheless, it was there that the United States Army inspired the movie Apocalypse Now with that scene of the stereo equipment, because they were blaring demonic screams from their helicopters overhead to disorient the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese. And I've described, that in depth in my.
How is Aquino connected to Apocalypse Now?
What he did in Vietnam, or what he was involved with, what the U.S. Army was involved with in Vietnam, inspired Francis Ford Coppola's scene in Apocalypse Now.
Really?
The Flight of the Valkyries, that Wagnerian music coming out of the stereo systems. Because that's what they were using to blare demonic screams to disorient the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army soldiers at that time. Now, that was something I go into depth in terms of how that was a failure and how Aquino took over from that point forward and wrote the Diabolicon in that environment in my DVD Satan's Crusaders. But we can go into that another time. Definitely I want you on my program in the near future, Max, on my program. So
what were you going to ask me? Because we were going to unearth, there was something you were going to ask me. Because
I wanted to bring up
Aquino.
Yeah, I want to bring up something that impacted Christine Joanna Hart that may also have impacted you, and that was the ceremony of the 9 angles. In 1972, Aquino wrote the Satanic Rituals. We're talking about a book that's several hundred pages long that was published in New York by Avon Books, and it's readily available to the public, though I don't recommend, of course, that they pursue it. But within the Satanic Rituals, Aquino brings forth several spells. There's at least 3 ceremonies that involve the Cthulhu Mythos of Howard Phillips Lovecraft, one of them being the ceremony of the 9 angles. And basically, he describes a ritual that is inspired by the horror at Red Hook, a short story written by H.P. Lovecraft. And, of course, all of this was originally produced by Michael Aquino for Anton Szandor LaVey, the founder of the First Church of Satan. And now these men were both convinced that there was much magic in feng shui, or geomancy, or the angles of architecture of various houses or facilities.
Which there are.
Yes, and of course they thought that this led to certain murders, suicides, etc. So they thought that they could use this kind of geomancy by their ritualism and what's described in the ceremony of the 9 angles. And of course the number 9 is a significant numeral within the Church of Satan symbolism.
Yes.
And
magic number.
Yeah.
Anytime whatever it's multiplied by, it comes back to itself.
Yes. And in the ceremony itself, a masked group would stand in a dim light, as I saw myself before a trapezoid, and they would evoke Azathoth, Yog-Sothoth, Nyarlathotep, and finally Shub-Nugaroth. And the last of these would appear, or rather a celebrant playing that role would appear, to be channeling as an avatar for the actual entity, and they would lead the participants through an enumeration of the powers and properties of the 9 angles. Now, Peter Moon spoke of a water ritual performed at Land's End in your nation where you're at right now, the United Kingdom. And this was the call to Cthulhu, which took place on the shores of a lake or other body of water where one would summon the great old one, Cthulhu, to whom the congregation would deliver a pan and a promise that he shall no longer return to his watery grave. Now, all of this was very much a part of this trapezoid kind of magic. The law of the trapezoid became a big part of the Church of Satan, and of course this became a part of the Temple of Set.
Temple of Set is obsessed with the trapezoid. Yeah.
Yes, that's quite right. And
that's what he offered me. As you were saying, Douglas, that's what he offered me when he lured me down the rabbit hole.
Yes, and that's what I wanted to drag out of Max and see what he would say about it, because basically one of the things that I was very familiar with was his use of a highly charged electrical field, white noise, and a pentagram that was lined with neon tubing. And during this ritual, the invoker would call the forces of darkness to emerge through the gates of the shining trapezohedron, and they would warn of the hounds of the barrier, obviously inspired by the hounds of Tundalos. And of course, much of this was stolen or cannibalized from the 8th section of the Emerald Tablets by Morris Doriel, a believer in the Hollow Earth theory and a founder of the Brotherhood of the White Temple. Now, all of this influence, of course, was something that became manifest when Aquino was seducing Christine Joanna Hart to try and step in to the trapezoid or the trapezohedron so that she could see anything she wanted, go anywhere she wanted in time, be anyone she wanted. He was offering her the universe, but she essentially
For what? So what was the trade?
I don't know why he did that, Max. It's when I sent him the first email, before he came back to me via email, we've talked over email, but he appeared to me as like this rabbit figure. He shot off. I came out of my body then without my control and went down after him. I went falling, came to the bottom of a hole, and he took me down a tunnel out, and we were looking at the kind of black sky, and he showed this tetra, I can't say it, and he told me if you get inside it, you can travel anywhere in time and go to different wherever you want and go inside their body and live as them. He said, he said, would you like to do this? And I said, no, I don't want to. And he said, why not? And then he started saying how we were the fallen angels and the old God had gone, and that we have the same
we
power.
Were the fallen angels? Who's the reference point? We is it?
I think he meant him. He just said, we are the fallen angels. We have that power. We must claim their power because the old God is gone, and that is our right. And I said, then I said, what about Jesus Christ? And as soon, I said, I love Jesus Christ. I love Jesus, or something like that. And then all of a sudden, I found myself knocked back into my body. But he did come for me again and again, and it lasted about a week where he was pulling me out of, through the body, through my feet, and taking me off, asking me who was I and what was my agenda. Of course, I haven't got an agenda. I'm just a single mother. So I said, I don't have an agenda. And he started saying, it's what you're doing now. It's what you're doing now. And I said, well, I'm not doing anything now. So that was weird. But Douglas said that it's, what did that mean then? What was he offering me?
If there's any time somebody offers you something like that, anything like that, especially astrally, if you take it, you are then bound. You are then bound to that person. It's interesting. Is your last name really Hart? Hart?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's interesting. Like I said to you, there's an attack on the heart, and your name is that. It's definitely tied in. I know about the trapezoid. I know about the order of the trapezoid too, and that particular geometric shape allows different routes to different frequencies. For example, also like in the UFC, they use an octagon. Well, they use an octagon because that particular shape to fight in will also draw an energy vortex to draw warriors through. So these particular geometric shapes are all being used for different reasons, and to pull from different densities or different frequencies.
He did try and get me, Max, to drink. I think it was blood. He said it was angel blood. He said you got to drink. I said
no. Do not. They got me. I was caught with that in 2008, and I did. And they, in an astral thing, they got me to drink something. And for 3 days after that, anything that and this was in the dream, when I woke up from the astral experience, when I woke up from it, everything that I put in, everything that I ate tasted like, if it's possible, like lava. Like liquid, like burning rock, or what I would assume to be a deep burning smell. And I couldn't eat anything for 3 days afterwards, and then everything came back to normal. So I had some imagery as well of this being that had been chained up in the middle of the earth for a very, very, very long time, right? And what I think they were trying to do is through a sex magic ritual, they were trying to place whatever this particular thing was, and place it then into me. So then there has to be some consuming of something, and then because I was in paralysis while this was going on. I heard all the sounds. I heard the things that were going on. There was definitely a ritual going on, and this was in the days after I'd had that dream. I've gone into it a little bit before. I'm not going to go into it now, but anyway, whatever they were trying to do didn't take, because what did stay in me, it only stayed in for 3 days, and then my body rejected it out again.
Right.
Yes.
It's interesting. I don't know why they do that. I mean, I had that weird attack when I was talking about the phone hacking in MI6. It was like walking down the street. I started really coughing, and I thought it was dust from a passing lorry. But then I went into the lucid dream state, and I had this communication saying, "We got you today. If you carry on doing what you're doing, we'll get you again." And I don't know. I mean, can they do that, or was that my imagination?
They do a lot of intimidating and a lot of puffing up their feathers to make you frightened more than anything else.
But they can't actually touch you.
It depends where your standpoint is. If you're resonating at a frequency which is lower, if you're doing things that are more bestial, more primal,
watching pornography. That kind of thing.
Any of that, anything that's sort of like, then you become an easier target, because that means you're vibrating at the frequency they're at, so they can work with you or get hold of you.
Interesting. That goes on. I mean, who are these people we're talking about? Is it like Aquino said? Who are they? Who have got the dark agenda for the earth? Is it archons, or is it the fallen angels, or reptilians?
Yeah.
I wanted to ask that because you were on Channel 4 TV, and you were talking, and well done you. You're probably the only human being ever to get on Channel 4 mainstream TV, one of our main channels, and talk about
He played something decent too, and it wasn't too. I was surprised at that.
You were brilliant. You were fantastic.
Thank you.
And my hero. Well done for coming out and saying that. And are reptilians the fallen angels?
Well, the thing is, within this part of this corner of the universe, there's lots of different types of beings, and there's lots of different types of beings with good and bad agendas. From what I can see and from what I've been shown over the years, there seems to be a reptoid type-looking being, almost like they almost look like dinosaurs. They're like enormous, and they seem to be at the top. They seem to be sort of calling the shot. It's a very strict hierarchy down, and I think the lower they within the reptoid sort of genetics, they have their hierarchy going down there too, and they don't have the ones that are in the ruling positions on the planet. This is my opinion. The ruling positions on the planet are hybrids. They're human reptoid or human hybrids, because so they have to have the human DNA so that they will come across as that way. To keep themselves looking at least half human, they got to keep consuming bodily human high energy bodily fluids from human beings, especially ones who are extremely sensitive, because that also gives them a high. It's almost like a drug trade. There's something called Adrenochrome, which that word has come up over and over in kind of circles that I've heard about, and it's when you bring a human being to the point of absolute fear, a chemical is released into the blood, which is sort of to calm down the person. But then if blood is taken from the person at that time, that chemical is within it. They use that as a drug, and it's on the black market, and it's very it's very sought after. So by them consuming these, that allows them to they have a masterful understanding of human genetics and human DNA and the building blocks and how it works. And they understand that it's just keys unlocking and locking to have a physical form. It's not as complicated as it was.
So what does that mean? Keys unlocking the human form?
Basically, everybody, most people on the planet, human beings, have a dual strand DNA, 2 strands, human and reptilian. The old primal reptilian brain and the new neo-mammalian brain. Sorry, I lost myself there. So what were you asking me?
The keys. What are the keys?
So to maintain the physical form, there's the locks and keys, and they blend in, and then that will create somebody with brown hair or blonde hair or green eyes or white skin or yellow skin or whatever. And if it's known how to unlock, move, and then relock into another position, then hair color will change, height will change, etc., etc. When you have people with multiple personality disorder or dissociative identity disorder, when they switch personalities, their eye color will change, or they may have a scar appear on their body that wasn't there before, because in that particular personality, that is real to them. And then in their
that's interesting, because the serial killer Kenneth Bianchi, when I met him, his eyes went from blue to dark brown, and somebody said when they met Ted Bundy, he had the same thing. And I've never seen eyes change. I was like, what? You've got brown eyes? What? You've got blue eyes?
That's the DNA codes unlocking and relocking up again. That's just on a smaller level.
So that means what?
That's shape-shifting. That's shape-shifting, but on a very minor scale.
Does that mean that? What does that mean about Bianchi? He's had mind control,
He means he's got compartmentalized personalities through trauma.
Oh, I see.
And it's very. Diane Sawyer is an interviewer on American television. Big interviewer. I've watched many of her interviews, and she is one of the top female handlers. She handles a lot of young, sort of up-and-coming stars, musicians and actresses, females though, and she has most of the codes for these young Monarch girls, Monarch programming being sexual programming. She has the codes for them, so she knows what hand movements to do. She knows what words to layer in to shift to within each within each bubble of personality. There's an amnesia barrier around the outside, so that particular personality is not aware that any of the other ones exist. But there are doorways that lead through, sort of tunnels, and if you know how to open it with a color or a word, then you switch it to the next one, and then you have a new personality. It may not be that different from the original one, but it's enough to shift somebody to say or do what you want them to do.
Oh, that's absolutely fascinating. So these leading back, Peter, to your work and your books, that was what was going on at Montauk, wasn't it? That kind of experimentation on the human race.
Well, there was a lot of strange experimentation that would sort of coincide with that to some extent.
Yeah, it's fascinating. We've had a fascinating show. I haven't read out the show has donations, and I haven't read that out. But if you want to support Revolution Radio, please go to their support page and make a donation. I do believe we're short this month, so that will be really, really helpful. The support page is www.freedomslips.com/support. Douglas, would you like to round off the show?
Can I just say one thing very quickly,
yes,
Christine?
Max.
I just noticed that there's still a few record stores in the UK that, Tower Records and all the ones in America sort of closed down, but there's still a few HMV in the UK. There's these T-shirts that I'm noticing people wearing everywhere, and it's got the unicursal hexagram on it, which is Crowley's OTO symbol, which is drawn with one single line, so there is no broken line. It's something to do with an unbroken will. If you do the symbol without a break, it means unbroken will. So, which is thelema, which is self-will, or do what thou wilt. I'm seeing these people who have no clue what it means or what it is wearing them everywhere. So subtly, that eon of Horus, the eon that they've been pushing this agenda for so long, is sort of creeping in to modern day, and people aren't aware of it at all. I couldn't believe it when I saw those things.
I think they're targeting the young. They're definitely going to the young. I mean, my son is reading revolting books by someone called Darren Shan, and it's compulsory reading. And even when I complained to the head of English, they said, "Oh, what's wrong with your son that this upsets him?" I mean, it's about a woman having her limbs cut off. The blood sprays over the boys. It's got
kidding me.
No, I'm not. I'm really angry about it, actually. And it's got the older man and the younger boy. And the older man seduces the younger boy by sucking. He cuts his finger. He sucks it off. And you constantly have the oral in, out, in, out. Yeah. Then it has a spider, a tarantula spider, grips on the mouth of the older man. And it pulsates its body in and out of the mouth and then spurts its liquid into the mouth. My son came home and he was really, really upset. He said, "Mummy, I know what that's supposed to be, a man's pee-pee going in the in the guy's mouth." I mean, they're not stupid. They're 11 years old, but why are they being read this absolute filth? And then when I tracked down Shan, it's vile. And then when I tracked down Shan, he says, "I'm a Christian. I give a Christian message." I mean, the end of the book ends up with the young boy climbing inside a coffin because he wants to kill his family, but they're boring, and he wants to go with the older man. Then he comes out of the coffin, climbs on the back of the older man, and they go off serial killing.
Unbelievable. I mean, it's sort of like I can't. It's an unbelievable thing.
That's been compulsorily read to 11-year-olds in 11-year-olds. My son is 11-year-olds, and they've got all it's a state thing, and they've got all the Darren Shan books in the school. One or two of the boys are now reading Tunnel of Blood. Again, more blood, gore, and occult. And it's true occult, Max. It's not made up.
I know. Yeah.
It's what it's move out of the way, let it come inside you, because then you get psychic powers, boys, and that's much more exciting than liking your mum, dad, your little sister, and all that kind of stuff.
Just the last thing I want to say, and this will be the last thing. The one eye sign that it's everywhere, covering one eye. Okay, so we're assuming it's the eye of Horus. Remember, Set took the eye of Horus out in a fight when he was having a battle with Horus. He ripped it out of his eye. It's when they do that symbol, it's them mocking the fact that they took Horus's eye.
Thank